Our last class, the F107 block, before we get to review, but this is going to cover operational contract support. This is not contracting, which is done by the 51s. This is the management, the planning and the management for the use of contractors to support mission requirements. And as you can see by the slide here, it's always good to make sure you double check what your contractors are doing. Otherwise, you don't get the exact requirement you want, because this should have actually been written in Arabic and not. This is a note from the G4 about a year ago, back during Operation United Assistance to Africa, where they sent trainers from Fort Lee out to Fort Campbell to train officers and soldiers in OCS before they deployed over to Africa. The G4 sends a weekly report to all the 4-stars with only about 3 bullets on it, and that was real critical that week.
We've looked through all the force management process, and we're at the end now in F106. So after going through identifying the capabilities, building organizations, buying equipment, and integrating them, if there's still a capability gap, what do we do? And that's where operational contract support comes in, helps us fill any remaining gaps that weren't planned for in the force management process.
Remember back in our TA class where they look at the weights, very little weight is put on organizations that are needed in phases 4 and 5 of operations and to stabilize and transition over. And the majority of what you need then is going to be contracted as opposed to green suit forces.
So what is operational contract support? Again, the key here is it is the planning, integration, execution of contract support. So this is not conducting contracting. This is the managing and the planning and the integration of contracting.
If you think of it in line of if you're your organization and you need an MP platoon to provide security, or if you need a truck platoon to provide lift for your organization, you're going to have to plan for, integrate, and execute that support with that platoon. This is no different. How you are going to get a contracted company to do that security or lift for transportation? How are you going to plan, integrate, and execute the use of that contracted company to do this? There are a few subtle differences, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
And throughout this class, we're going to be talking about some general principles. Just the key ones to highlight is that contracting is a significant force multiplier, but it's not the only source, and it's not always the first choice we should go to. A lot of people get addicted to contracting as a quick fix, but there are different options that we need to think about, some questions we need to ask ourselves before going to the contract solution. Also, command authority is not equal to contracting authority, and we'll talk about that. And there are also non-cost related factors you need to consider when you're thinking about conducting contracting, which we'll discuss. And then make sure that as early as possible you integrate contracting. It needs to be integrated early, it needs to be planned for thoroughly to make sure that it's effective.
As Chris mentioned, contractors are a force enabler, but you have to realize they provide a service for dollars. They don't wear a green suit, but they have to do a specific mission they're hired to do. They are commercial businesses. They differ from the military in that they're not combatants. They're civilians authorized to accompany the force, and it's a complete regulation and legal parameters and limitations on what they can and can't do. And their management is through contracting channels. You as the commander, or if you're advising the commander, don't have the same authority to direct them to do a job. You have to go through the contracting 51 Charlie community to do those changes to a contract.
And contractors can perform almost any task except those that are inherently governmental functions. So it is important for you to understand what contractors can and cannot do. But also understand that when you bring on a contractor, they require support themselves. So you need to understand what your requirement to them is going to be when you bring them in. They can go to almost any location that we need them to go to, which is a definite plus for contractors. But they also must comply with U.S. and international law. So keeping all those things in mind when you plan for contracting, there's definitely pluses and minuses to having a contractor come in.
When you look at required support services, if you're going to have, let's go back to our example of a platoon that's going to, a company that's going to come in and do our transportation and security. Are we going to feed them? Are we going to provide their medical? Are we going to house them? Are they going to live on base or off base? Are we going to provide transportation to them to and from it? All those different things have to be factored in. And it's one of those things you have to think about, because we don't think about that if it's a green suit organization coming in. If it's a MP company coming in, we automatically know we're going to provide food, medical, housing for them. We don't think, false assumptions, because we don't think through the processes early on. One of the things about contracts, a lot of people think, oh, that's just loggy stuff. Well, no, it's not. Look at what we provided over in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can see they cut across all the staff functions. So it's not just a loggy function. The G3 is responsible for the planning. G1 is responsible for the personal accountability of contractors. And contractors also provide many services throughout. So here's what contractors cannot do. Inherently governmental functions, such as direct kinetic combat operations. They can provide security for convoys or bases, but they cannot be hired specifically to go do a four-man stack and go into an assault, an objective, or fire artillery onto someone with that intent. Force protection is different.
They also can't supervise contractors or government employees. So you have a contracting officer representative who would be doing that task. So contractors cannot supervise themselves. They also can't obligate government resources. So an example of this would be you may have a contractor working at a warehouse. A shipment comes in and they start to unload it. But you have to have a green suitor actually sign for that stuff because the contractor, once they sign for it, has obligated government resources, and they can't do that. So there are certain things you need to have a green suitor and a contractor working hand in hand on.
So with legal issues, a lot of things you have to understand about this, and you always need to know who your lawyer is and keep in touch with them. This is applicable to contractors authorized to accompany the force. They are subject to the UCMJ, but journalists aren't going to be for violent crimes or for egregious acts. If a contractor gets caught stealing CDs at the PX, you're not going to tag them with UCMJ. But the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act makes the UCMJ applicable to them. If you want to do this, say a contractor stabs a soldier or a contractor stabs another contractor, and you want to apply UCMJ, you have to go through your lawyer, and that, according to the media law, has to go up to the Department of Justice, who has to make a decision. So always keep that in mind. And there are the SOFA agreements are all subject to that, what contractors will or will not be allowed to do by the host country.
As we said earlier, there are certain questions you want to ask yourselves when you're making the decision whether you want to use contractors or not. And this is just some of those, a little simple flow chart for things to think about. So the first question, the forces that are needed to fill that requirement, are they in the structure? If they are and they're available, then you're going to use that structure. If they're not, then you want to think about host nation. Can the host nation provide that service? If the answer is yes, then use them. Increase the economy of that local area, helps all people involved. If not, then you want to look at an external contractor bringing in third country nationals. And again, there are many support requirements associated with that. There are legal requirements associated with that. There's geopolitical issues associated with that. If you look at the example of Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, bringing in third country nationals was a big problem, but the requirement needed specified skills that the Djiboutians didn't have. It just turned into a big thing. So again, you want to think about all those things before you consider bringing in a contractor to fill a requirement.
All right, JP 410 lays out a 5-step OCS management process, and it all starts with planning. And that's what you're doing today. This is at the Army Service Component Commands at the COCOM levels. Whatever plans they have to start now integrating what functions are going to be done by contractors. And it doesn't matter what the function is. They need to know how many contractors are going to have. They have to decide, are we going to feed them? Are we going to house them? If we're not going to feed them, where are they going to get it? How are they going to come into theater? What restrictions they're going to have? What training are they going to need before they come into theater so that can be added to the contract? All those different things have to be worked. There's some very smart people. There's contracting planning cells in each of the COCOMs. There's a LOGCAP manager in each ASCC from Army Sustainment Command to help plan for this. 51 Charlies can help with a lot of this. And then once you do that planning, when the need arises, for contractors to deploy, they go through all their pre-deployment, much like a unit does. Theater clearance requirements. Where are they going to come into theater? A cell has to be stood up by the contract company to bring them in. G1 has to put some people there to do accountability of people in and out of theater. Required training. They have to do it at their home station. What's going to be done in theater? They deploy in, joint reception station, spot tracking. How are they going to come in? Because the lines of communication are used by everybody. So is the Army going to bring their stuff in? Or the Air Force, or are they going to bring it all in on their own? But they're all going to be using the same ports, the same airfields, the same rails, the same roads. And that all has to be deconflicted. Once they're in theater, this then becomes the day-to-day support and the rules of engagement for the contractors managed by the requiring activity that asks for the contractors. And then once the operation ends, or you do a planning changeover, at contract changeover, you have to plan that changeover, much like a RIP TOA, or you terminate the contract when it ends. People have to leave, and you have to get the equipment back that was government furnished property, or the contractor has to get rid of their own property or redeploy it themselves. Again, over the same lines that you're redeploying U.S. forces.
All these things will be found in the Annex W to any op order. That is the Operational Contract Support Annex to the op order.
Now, some management principles. Contractors are not part of the formal military chain. We mentioned this earlier. Just because a commander thinks they're in charge of everything and the contractor is doing work for them, that is correct, but that doesn't mean they can go tell the contractor who is hired for security, okay, I want you now to work in a dining facility. That's outside of the federal acquisition regulation and the contract. They have different legal statuses in military and civilians. Check with your legal officer on that. They can't do other duties as assigned. Whatever's in the contract is what they do. So they don't attend hail and farewells. They don't attend organizational days. If you hire somebody to be as a staff planner, they then are not authorized to go and clean the toilets because that's not part of the contract. Or they can't be the security officer or activity because all this is the contract officer's arena, but requires a lot of input from you, the requiring activity. You have to do all the planning. Then you determine the requirements with the help of the contracting officer, but the contracting officer is not an expert in what you need. The contracting officer is an expert in writing contracts because the contracting officer, before you go meet with them, has somebody in there talking about requirements for nurses. Now they're talking to you about physical security and transportation. The next person is going to come in talking signal communications technology support. So the contracting office is relying on you to tell them exactly the 5 W's of what you need. The contracting officer will then write the contract, send it out for bid, approvals. They will execute the contract, sign the formal document. You will then, once that's signed, you'll then start managing the contractors, the execution of the mission, and then the contracting office will work contract closeout to end or transfer the mission to a new contractor at rebid if that happens. But you have to pay for all this action, and you are involved in all these steps as the requiring activity. Now, if you think of contracting, it is commander's business. It's no different than any other thing. If you look at this chart, it's a coalition of the willing down here. You've got the warfighter coming up with the requirements. Finance has got to pay for it. Contracting office will do all the different work in here. And the contractor, the company, comes in and does the work. And a lot of times, the contracting office, the finance office, and the warfighter don't all work for each other. If you think about the top up here, it's kind of MDMP. In the first step, you do the requirements generation where you determine all your facts and assumptions. You come up with it. You brief the commander at friction point 1 to give them a asthma check. Make sure you've got all the requirements and exactly what you want. You do the contract award. That's really nothing more than COA selection. The commander doesn't award the contract, doesn't have a say in which company, but you're involved in that process before you get there. Commander gets it. You start administering the contract. That's nothing more than executing the operation. And then the commander gets involved at the end of closing it out, paying the bills, make sure everybody gets out, the contract, all the equipment comes back to us, the contractors depart, and you close out the contract. That's nothing more than an AAR and recovery after an operation.
So who can help in regards to operational contract support? First one would be the Army Contracting Command. At the brigade level, who you're going to be dealing with is going to be your contracting teams, but there are also different other levels of command. These are the folks who actually write the contract. So you go to them with the requirement. They help write that contract, source it out, and then take the bids and come back and actually have the contractors join your team. Inside your team, you'll have a contracting officer representative, the Corps. Now, if you have a problem with the contractor, you don't go to that contractor, you go to the Corps. They know that that Corps goes back to the contracting officer, and that's the people who are going to say, okay, you're out of here, or may be able to affect their company having more contracts in the future. So they're going to listen to that core because they know that they're helping write their evaluation.
Now, remember, the core is appointed by the requiring activity, so he works for the commander, but the core is also appointed by the contracting officer who is nominated. The contracting officer representative's got two bosses, the KO on the contracting side, and he's probably being rated or senior rated by the commander within that organization. So understand that about the COR is in your unit, but that's your person to go through with authority over the contractor.
So you want to make sure that you give the core ample opportunity to do that job as the core. They may have other responsibilities and jobs, but you want to make sure, number one, they're knowledgeable and what they're going to be supervising the contractor doing, and that they have adequate time to do that job. Other organizations that you have is you have the AFSB out there. It's going to be looking at more of a AMC contract maintenance issues, things of that nature. You're going to have the OCS cell at different levels, Theater Support Command at the COCOMs, and they're going to help with the planning, synchronization of contracts. The legal office, which is critical when you're talking about contracts, make sure that you're not exceeding your authority or the contractors aren't neglecting their responsibility. And then LogCap also has a project manager in many different locations in every country, and they work as a liaison between the contracting officer and the contractor themselves. So they're a great asset as well.
So the organization is several out there, and you have to understand that authorities that are out there. One's contracting and one's requirements and planning. On the contracting side, all contracting authority comes from the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. That's currently Ms. Heidi Shue. So she gives all these commanders authorities to spend money on writing contracts for the Army. Command authority over these units and their operations comes through the Army Material Command, through Army Contracting Command, down to the units where we discussed that are out there on the battlefield to help you. The Contract Support Brigade, the Contingency Contracting Battalion, or the Contingency Contracting Team. The Contract Support Battalions are take on to the TSCs in each theater, and the teams are out there for the requiring activities writing their contracts. The COCOM, the ASCCs, and these organizations here, to include the requiring activity, we didn't put an organization because that could be a company, or that could be a brigade, that could be the ASCC. They do the requirements and the planning for what they need the contractors to do, but the authority to write and obligate the Army for money on a contract comes through the Secretariat side, through the contracting chain.
So we briefly talked about some of the organizations, but now looking at more closely who supports who. So starting at the top of Army Material Command, going to the Army Contracting Command, and then to the Expeditionary Contracting Command. So there are higher level commands above, but actually supporting who. So you have the Contract Support Battalions, which are supporting the ASCCs. They're found underneath the TSCs at the corps level. And so this is really going to be the first or the highest level of contracting command that you probably deal with. Underneath that, you have the CCBNs, the Contingency Contracting Battalions, which are going to be supporting more at the division level. And then down at the brigade level, once you'll deal with more often than not, is the Contingency Contracting Team. So this is just a cell of a few folks that are there to support that brigade combat team, might be nested underneath the Sustainment Brigade to be able to do direct support to that brigade combat team writing those contracts. And this is just an example of contracting in use. So down at the ISB, the National Staging Base in Senegal during the Ebola crisis, there were many different requirements that needed to be resourced immediately and that the military couldn't get to, so they used contracting to fill those requirements. So in accordance with the CCT, the 101st Sustainment Brigade provided the corps to oversee the execution of those life support requirements.
So you can see part of the required forces, just so you know we're not making this stuff up. Required forces with 21st TSC, the 101st Sustainment Brigade, part of their team that they needed was a contingency contracting team with 5 people. Here's right where it is. These do exist, and they are out there supporting mission.
So what is it that keeps us out of trouble versus what gets you the cool orange slippers? So there's many different things out there with contracting that you need to make sure that you're aware of, and one of them is the actions that commanders can take. We've talked about some of these as we went through, but just to highlight some of the most critical, that first one, be familiar with the acquisition contracting process and the key players. That's absolutely critical. You have to know what the steps are and who helps you go through those steps in order to stay out of trouble. The impression of something that's going on that shouldn't be going on. And as we discussed earlier, you want to make sure that you consider all the options for filling a requirement before going to contracting. Contracting shouldn't be the first thought.
You got to integrate it into everything that you're doing and keep a good command relationship. If you're a commander, talk to the contractor commander. But if you're the major or lieutenant colonel out there in the planning cell, you've got no other contract support officers, make them part of your team.
Again, understand fully what your requirements are, understand what your capabilities are, and make sure you hold the contractors accountable for what they're accountable for. And again, really have quality CORs. I mean, that is your first line of defense. So make sure that they're trained and make sure they have time and the resources to do that mission.
There's an old saying within the contracting world or management lately that picking a person to be a COR is going to hurt your organization, then they're the right person to make the COR. Because contract officer representative's job is very hard, and you want to make sure that they've got somebody good to provide good quality oversight of the contracts and make sure that you're getting what we're paying for. And then you always want to make sure that you avoid any appearance of impropriety, that you're favoring contractors. You don't want to take any gifts from them, because you don't want to sit there with a Dynacor mug and all of a sudden the next contract to come in is Brown and Root, and now you've got a mug from another company. You just want to avoid any impropriety, and the best people to talk to about that is always talk to your legal folks or your contracting office to make sure that you're working well there. These are some of my observations after doing this as both a COR, battalion commander with 500 contractors, managing OCS within first TSC in Iraq and Afghanistan, and being the OCS policy chief in the G4 for 2 years. These are some OCS career management tips for you to help out. Plan. You cannot over-plan the use of contractors. You cannot over-supervise them, and you cannot over-supervise your CORs and help train them. You got to select the right CORs, talk to the right people. Always make the KO, the legal team, any of those good contracting folks, make them part of your organization. Invite them to your org days, invite them over to meetings, make them part of your team. Understand what you can and can't do with your contractors. Don't change a contract without going through the KO. You will obligate yourself, because now you're obligating the government for money that you can be held personally responsible for. Read the contracts that you have in your organization. So read every detail of them so you know what's supposed to be happening. And then review the paperwork that your COR is submitting every month to the KO to make sure that it's accurate and your COR is doing the right thing. And always avoid fraud, waste, and abuse, or even the perception that there might be some.
Just a summary of what we discussed throughout this lesson. First of all, OCS is commander's business. You need to understand what your requirements are and make sure you fulfill them. OCS is the planning and management of contractors. It is also the requiring activity that has many of those responsibilities. So again, commander's business, make sure you know what those requirements are. It's more than logistics. It goes across all the staff lanes, so everybody needs to have input when it comes to OCS. Be aware of those legal boundaries. Make sure you understand the organizations that are there to help you with the management of contractors. Make sure you have a strong relationship with them. Always remain in contact with the contracting officer and your legal team, because they're there to keep you out of trouble. Again, we cannot emphasize enough. Select the right COR. That is your first line of defense. And then the training is critical, not only for the COR, but for anybody else that's going to be dealing with those contractors.
So hopefully with this video, your readings, and the class we're going to have, you'll have a better understanding of some of the responsibilities you have as a field grade officer in the management of contractors and the planning of that to be successful in your mission and in your career.